Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this new episode of Archipiélago Histórico. And today we are finally arriving in Trinidad. So we have been having a lot of episodes throughout the Caribbean, with different representation from different Caribbean countries. And today we have the chance to talk about Trinidad. And for that, we have here Dr. Sanjay Badri-Maharaj, correct? Is that a
That's great.
good?
That's great.
That's perfect. All right. So finally, we have the chance to learn a little bit more about Trinidad and its history, particularly, an event that took place in 1990. So for the people in the audience who might not be familiar with your work, Dr. Badri Maharaj, please tell us about your interest and your background, please.
Okay. Well, I am Trinidadian, born and raised. I'm
Hmm.
generation four of Indian. I'm generation four of Indian migrants to the Caribbean, which we'll get into detail how we ended up there later on. But I am, one of my day jobs is as a lawyer. I am also a trained military analyst and consultant. I served with the Trinidad Ministry of National Security and Ministry of Attorney General for 6 years. But I'm also an independent practice as a lawyer and as a maritime lawyer in particular. Um, my formal training in the strategic affairs was at King's College London, and I've authored about 11 books on a variety of subjects ranging from nuclear weapons in India and Pakistan to a number of books relating to military history from Southern Asia into the Latin America Caribbean region. So I have a fairly broad spectrum of interests in this regard. And, you know, the region itself, the whole Latin America Caribbean region, has such rich military history, such a rich military historical tradition. And I think an armed forces with a record with, sometimes it's not great, sometimes it's not always perfect, but it's worth preserving and worth learning about because this is so much part of our history. And it's in some ways it's a shared history because though we come from different areas and we come from different uh, immediate historical backgrounds, the broader historical background is very similar. We've all been former Spanish colonies. We've all had various degrees of interest by other colonial powers. We've all come out of colonialism with different experiences, but we all have had to deal with a number of things that have been one set against us and two have worked out in our favor in some ways. We're also very fortunate to live in a region of the world that, despite its internal problems, has stayed clear of major interstate conflict since 1995. And we have to be very grateful for that. Since the Alto Sinapa War between Ecuador and Peru, we've not seen a major upsurge in interstate violence,
Mm.
and God hopes we never see one.
Hmm.
Uh, and that is something that the region should be very, very thankful for. And we've also been a region, I mean, in particular the Caribbean, outside of India itself. The Caribbean is the only area of British colonization that has remained consistently democratic. It's not straight into dictatorship. I mean, the closest you've had is Guyana, which is, only nominally part of the Caribbean in some ways. But the region has been very fiercely democratic. And that's not something we should ever take for granted.
Which is why one of the things that we're going to talk about today is so important that we shine a light on it, because I was doing some digging on my own, and apparently Trinidadians nowadays are not even aware that a coup took place in 1970, and a lot of people don't even know. I mean, mostly young people are not even aware of the 1990 insurrection that took place.
Well, to tell you the truth, it's not for want of trying.
Hmm.
The 27th of July just went, and it was the 34th anniversary. The newspapers did bring about some level of attention,
Mm.
but the truth is, we've had an entire generation now that was not born when it happened, didn't live through the experience, because the experience, I mean, we came really close to losing our democracy. in
Hmm.
1990. We came really, really close. And I think there has been a lack of willingness to discuss it. There have been attempts at creating a record and holding a commission of inquiry. The commission of inquiry produced a very interesting historical record that I was able to access and use quite extensively, but it did not address fundamental issues of the state at the time and the state today. And the other thing that we have to face is the elephant in the room. Nobody wants to face the fact that the Islamist insurrection of 1990 led to something much more serious, which is the growth of radical Islam in Trinidad. We became the highest contributor per capita to ISIS,
Hmm. Hmm.
to fighters to ISIS in the Western Hemisphere. To this day, there are about 100 women and children who went across there to support ISIS, particularly women. The children, some of them were born there. And they're still in camps held by the Kurds. Some Trinidadians were sentenced to imprisonment in Iraq for their role in the ISIS state. So, and much of this has its genesis in 1990. And 1990 is, on one hand, it was a traumatic event. On the other hand, it's an event that some elements in the country have done their best to forget happened. And the other thing that, I mean, and this comes back to my point about democracy, 1990 reflected an opportunity for the military to take over in Trinidad. At no point in time did they ever think of doing it. Their view was, we are loyal to a civilian constitution.
Hmm.
And they came through in 1990 in a really big way for that.
Before we go any further, I'd like to thank you for providing me what I think is most of your books, if not all. So thank you for that. That was
Oh, it's my
I
pleasure.
really
My absolute
appreciated
pleasure.
that. Yeah. So today we are going to talk about one of these books, which is very. I have the title here, Trinidad 1990: The Caribbean's Islamist Insurrection, and this is just one of many books you have written in conjunction with Hellion and Company, which is one of the, in my opinion, is probably one of the most important military history
It is.
publishers.
Yeah, I would say so.
Mm. There's some things I like to mention or just go over at least briefly because most of my
Sure.
audience is not from Trinidad. Uh, and I strive to talk about the Caribbean and learn about the Caribbean and its different islands and
Absolutely. Please.
nations. Yeah, it's very important. Um, so, for the people who aren't familiar with Trinidad, can you please give us some sort of overview, cultural, social, and you do talk about it some. At least you go through the ethnic
Right.
constitution of the
Yeah.
islands, and so on.
Yes.
Yes.
I think it is important. Trinidad, you can't talk about its history
Mm.
or its current or its politics without looking at its ethnicity and its demographics. Trinidad was colonized by Spain in 1492 and was very much a naval outpost. It wasn't even a formal base, it was a repair facility.
Mm.
There's a large natural asphalt lake there, and it was used to patch ships coming out, the treasure convoys coming out of Latin America, of South America, used Trinidad as a rest and repair stop. It never became a very prosperous or very well populated Spanish colony. But in 1797, the British took Trinidad and Tobago.
Mm.
There wasn't very much fighting. The Spaniards, after, just some resistance to maintain military respect, burnt their ships in Port of Spain harbor, Port of Spain being the capital city and the country's largest port. They burnt their ships there, and the British took over. Uh, the Brits remained from 1797 to 1962. What the Brits brought about was a fundamental shift in the population of Trinidad and Tobago. Now, because the Spaniards used it as a repair facility, Trinidad was not really a major agricultural colony, which means its population of African slaves was relatively small. It existed, but it was relatively small. Shortly after taking Trinidad and Tobago, unrelated to it, of course, but shortly after taking it, the British abolished the slave trade in the early 1800s. So, as Trinidad became viable for agricultural exploitation, they needed a source of labor. Slavery was not an option. So, what ended up happening to Trinidad and to many other islands in the Caribbean, but most noticeably in Guyana and Suriname, was the importation of a very large number of people from India to work as laborers on plantations. And they were brought in as indentured laborers, which means they were under a bond for 5 years.
Coolies, right?
Yeah, right. And I mean, that term now in Guyana, Trinidad, and Suriname, you will start a fight if you use that word. It's the equivalent of the N word.
Oh,
Yeah, in those countries, you will start a fight with those words. It's a term of great insult if you call someone that. But the
okay.
term was not intended as that to start with. It was just a description.
Right.
So that's what we were brought in as. And that's, where my background comes from. That's where the background of almost everybody of Indian descent in Trinidad, Guyana, and Suriname. Now, in other Caribbean islands, we should also point out Indians did come. They
Hmm.
just came in far smaller numbers. And they came into islands with already a very large Afro slave population. So many of them were absorbed. Whereas Trinidad, Guyana, and Suriname, you'll find a very distinct Indian identity as compared to everyone else. So you will find in Trinidad, Guyana, and Suriname, Indians maintaining religion. I mean, I myself am a practicing Hindu now, after 178 years being in Trinidad. You find them maintaining certain religious and cultural customs. So you'll find food with very striking similarities to food in certain parts of rural India.
Hmm.
You'll find the remnants of language. It's not much. Very few of us speak very much Hindi, but a few words remained. How you'd refer to your grandparents, how you'd refer to certain things, those are kept. So it's these little bits of things that remain. But also, because of the numbers that came in, you were also able to form very coherent communities which exist to this day. And in all three countries, and you can't separate them really in terms of the political experience, is that unfortunately, when democracy came, ethnicity was one of the mobilizing factors in politics. Race, religion, all of that came into being. So Trinidad went from being a British colony to an independent state in 1962 to a republic in 1976. All through that time, the Indian population was growing and becoming more and more educated. And this had a very significant impact on the bureaucracy of the academic sector, of the business sector, of the small business sector, of the professions. And while I don't want to exaggerate it, there is racial tension in places like Trinidad, but it's nothing compared to Guyana, which is terrible. And Suriname is very close to becoming a post-racial country right now.
What? I'm sorry.
What I would define as post-racial, where the race of the politician matters less than what political party they belong to. So you'll find the two major political entities in Suriname,
Hmm.
the current VHP, which is led by President Chan Santoki, an Indian, and the the NDP, which was led by former dictator Bouterse. They are both very ethnically mixed parties. And when Chan was elected as president, his race was very little by way of being a factor. Although it was there to be. I mean, you can't take it away, but it was very much there. It was not a factor. In Guyana, for example, though, in 2020, race was the dominant factor in the electoral system, and it can turn very nasty very quickly. In Trinidad, race is a major factor in politics, but it has not turned nasty in a very long time. and the nastiness is often verbal rather than anything more than that.
Mm-hmm.
Generally speaking, Trinidad has been very fortunate in that we get along reasonably well as a people. Now, in the lead up to 19, and this is what we're speaking of here, of the 1990 event, Trinidad had already undergone a few ups and downs in its path. In 1962, it became independent. Things seemed to be going okay. In 1970, however, and this was reflective of the Black Power movement in the United States, there was major socio-economic unrest in the country. And for one reason or another, that ended up with a mutiny of the army. So the 1st Battalion of the Trinidad and Tobago Regiment mutinied. And there was a lot of concern at the time whether the country would survive as a democracy. Again, those fears were unfounded. The mutiny was suppressed within a few days without much force being used. And the country recovered quite quickly. And in 1976, it became a republic. It's a constitutional presidency. There's a very strong history of rule of law, very strong courts, very strong level of respect for the Constitution. That's ingrained in all of us. I mean, we're not a perfect country by any means. We're deeply flawed. But what also happened then is the country underwent an economic boom in the 1970s, thanks to oil prices. Trinidad is it's no longer a major producer of oil, but it was a major producer of oil and natural gas. What that was used for was a huge public works program, which was very corrupt, but it led to a lot of investment in schools. And Trinidad's population is quite well educated. Education is seen as a method of upward mobility, and it is valued. It is very much valued. So you also have, so what that also means, it's an aspirational population.
Mm-hmm.
By 1986, the country had gone into a very deep recession. Oil prices has collapsed, multiple mistakes were made, the country went into a recession. When that recession took place, the government, for the first time in independence, changed. There was an election, and the ruling dispensation was voted out of office. Now, coming into that period, 1986 to 1990, it is hard to say the economic deprivations were severe. The country went to the IMF. There were restructuring arrangements to be made. There was a lot of austerity. There were a lot of mistakes made during that austerity program. But one of the things that happened was the security apparatus in the country began to fray quite badly. And to this mix, a group called the Jamaat al-Muslimin,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
led by an extraordinarily charismatic, he's passed away now, but he was genuinely charismatic. A former policeman by the name of Lennox Phillip who converted to Islam in Canada as Yassin Abu Bakr, became the leader of this entity, heavily influenced by Islamic liberation ideas of people like Malcolm X, of very much inspired by the Black Power movement. He was also inspired by Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Gaddafi was known to give out a lot of money to Islamic missionaries, and the Muslimin benefited enormously from it. The Muslimin initially seemed to be doing good work by helping out deprived kids, bringing them into some level of discipline, some level of, being father figures to many of them. The dark side to it was they too ended up being involved in organized crime. And the narcotics trade at that time began to take off to an incredible level. Narcotics shipments from South America passed through Trinidad. It corrupted the judiciary, it corrupted the police, it corrupted customs. It led to a decay in faith in the security apparatus. It led to a new class of criminal coming up. I mean, Trinidad is like any country; it's always had a criminal class, but this class was now divided into groups that were the people who facilitated the smuggling of drugs and the muscle.
Um, you
Sure,
mentioned something very important
sure.
that I'd like you to explain a little further, because you're mentioning some economic problems that led to what you're talking about now, which
Yeah,
is the introduction and some uh, just the drug market and
sure.
criminals becoming more, let's say, pervasive and
Mm.
and more seen in Trinidadian society. But I'd like you to you're talking about how economic problems lead to unrest, and that's something
Yeah,
that a lot of people ignore. And there is a correlation. Can
there
you
is.
can you tell us more about how throughout history, or maybe just in the case of Trinidad, whenever you have economic unrest and economic problems, you do create other problems that eventually may
Yeah,
lead to violence. There is a correlation
there
there.
is a correlation. You see, Trinidad underwent periods of boom and bust several times.
Mm.
But the severity of what happened in the 1980s was something we had never seen before. And you have to also remember something else. Because of the nature of Trinidadian society, you actually had two tiers of Trinidadian society of similar socioeconomic status operating almost completely in parallel. And let me put it this way.
Mm.
The Indian population of Trinidad was largely, even though it was increasingly educated and worked in towns, lived in rural areas. The family unit remained relatively strong. So you didn't have a huge breakdown of the family. So despite the fact that people had a hard time making ends meet and had a really hard time making ends meet, Indians being small businessmen, shopkeepers, they really suffered during the economic downturn. But contrast that to what was happening in urban areas, which were dominated by Afro Trinidadians. The drug gangs were able to carve out turf within those communities. The family unit began breaking down at a very alarming rate. So while Indian kids would still go to school, a lot of Afro Caribbean kids started dropping out of the system. The schools were there, the opportunities were there, but the societal fabric needed to keep a kid in school, to tell the kid, look, stay in school, there is a future for you, work hard. That started to break down. So you started to now see an underclass coming up, an underclass defined not by money, but by dropping out of a system or by excluding itself from a system. And that is where a lot of this unrest comes from, because this underclass is ripe fodder for gangs. You have a kid with, his mother is struggling to make ends meet, no father figure, no coherent society, no, um, the expression, it takes a village to rear a child. When the community itself is no longer coherent, and that breakdown takes place much more rapidly in urban areas than rural areas, you set yourself up for trouble. Add to this equation now an economic downturn, a severe economic downturn, where the state cannot provide the welfare measures that it had done in the past, where you have this new and very attractive uh, criminal activity, narcotics, the narcotics trade.
Mm.
So even if you're not selling drugs, you're running protection rackets. You're running, low level drug dealing on street corners. You have this very attractive market coming in there. And when you have that combined with the complete loss of credibility of the state security apparatus, the policeman is no longer, he's as corrupt as anything. Um, Police corruption went from being taking a bribe for looking the other way for a traffic incident to taking a bribe for letting thousands of kilograms of cocaine come through. So you have that breakdown of trust in the security establishment. There was a very famous report that's largely been hushed up, but it's out there, called the Scott Drug Report,
Hmm.
which indicated the level of corruption in the judiciary and in higher society and in the body politic of the country. So this created a great deal of difficulty. The police itself underwent a major crisis of confidence when its elite units were found to be heavily involved in the drug trade. So you have this entire mix going on there, and you're adding an economic downturn into it. And the economic downturn was felt by the average person, the upper and lower middle classes, and the working classes felt it most acutely. The elites of society remained largely insulated. And this created a little bit of tension above and beyond the tension that was already existing.
Hmm.
That being said, what sparked the 1990 event was a combination of factors. Thanks to the IMF, the government of Trinidad and Tobago had to do something that's never been done before or since in Trinidadian history, which is to cut the salary of the civil service. This led to massive protests. Religious groups across the board supported those protests. The trades unions were very active in those protests. And into this mix, Mr. Abu Bakr comes, speaking the same language of the protesters. He speaks the language that all of us were concerned about. The government of the time was, although it didn't call itself a coalition, was a coalition of different political and racial groups.
Hmm.
It managed to break itself up. So an entire group, which was largely Indo-Trinidadian, that's of Indian descent, found itself expelled from the party. So the government's credibility was down. The anger levels were coming up because of socioeconomic factors. Criminality was at a high because of the drug trade. Confidence in the police was way down. And into all of this, Mr. Bakr comes with his group of 120 odd men, some of whom are really boys, but call them men. Because of the corruption in the system, Bakr was able to import a very large quantity of weapons. And it's with this in mind, a confrontation emerged between the government and Bakr over a structure that was mishandled by everybody concerned. Bakr, the government, everybody. And this was a spark that led to the events of July 27, 1990.
Okay. Before we go there, and because you are bringing stuff up that are very essential for us to understand. Um, and I have noticed that too here in the United States. I have seen and I have noticed how Indians in general tend to be very family oriented. And you guys seem to push a lot for advanced education. Get a master's degree, get a PhD, do this, and that. This is how you get those jobs that enable you to, as you were saying earlier in this episode, escalating, uh, move in the hierarchy,
Yeah.
socioeconomic hierarchy. What are those cultural factors that provide this? I want to understand the culture
Well,
that makes you,
yeah.
be that way.
Well, it's hard to really say. I mean, the fact is, how to put it this way: you either got an education or you remain, in Trinidad cutting sugarcane. That was your choice.
Mm.
You either did you, and what happened is, you know, I don't think people give enough credit in some ways to a trade union. Trinidad's Indians all were linked to the sugar industry at one point, whether working directly or as independent contractors or as farmers who supplied produce to the industry. We were all linked in, but nobody wanted to remain in it. So kids were taught at an early age, go to school, get an education, do something. So even if you didn't, so what ended up happening? Uh, since the 1940s and 1950s, education was seen as a way out of poverty. My grandfather was a cane farmer. Education helped my dad become a doctor.
Hmm.
Um, and to this day, you can still see in Trinidad's parliament members of parliament whose parents were illiterate, but who themselves have gone on to get doctorates. And you were always pushed to do something in school. So you would find that even if you did not go on to get a degree or an advanced degree, you were always pushed to get what would be in the United States a grade 10 education. And in Trinidad, we model ourselves on the old British system. So there's something called a full certificate you get at 16 at secondary level. The full certificate includes English, mathematics, and three other subjects at a certain level, at a standardized exam. That's actually quite an intense exam. You're pushed to get that because with that, that's your basis to do things. And I mean, you the you know Indian society is far from perfect in Trinidad. But first of all, Indian society in Trinidad is very different to say Indian society
Of course, yeah.
in the United States. We're on a much poorer level
But
than the
you
Indians in the United
but
States.
you can you can
You
still
can
see
see,
some
yeah,
core values, and that's what I'm
but
trying to
yeah,
get at.
education was seen as a way out, right?
Mm.
And anything that you could do to get you, even if to get your foot on that ladder of getting out, was there. There was no fetishization of being on the land, even though Indians are still heavily involved in agriculture in Trinidad. Their children aren't. And this is a really big deal
Mm.
because, I'll put it to you this way. Among the Indo Trinidadians who are less socioeconomically well off, they are also pushing their children to do better than they did in school. So they would make any sacrifice necessary. And it is a history of sacrifice because parents would do anything to give their kids a chance at education. And I mean anything, sell land, mortgage property, um, do anything to get that education. And the kids in the main, I mean, it's not perfect, but they've been helped by, one of the things that Trinidad really did right was make education up to secondary level completely free. So how good you are depends on what school you go to. It's all by competitive exam. And there is a lot of competition for places in very good secondary schools. But what that means is that the entire standard has gone up across the board, and all the schools are funded by the government. They're run by various bodies, but they're all funded by the government, so they're all free. So people from the middle class, people from the poor backgrounds, all have a chance at going to a top-rate secondary school. And it's all through competitive examination. So if you've got the brains and you've got the willpower, you could make it. And education at university level is subsidized.
Mm.
So it's easier to get a university degree than it might be in the United States or it might be in many parts of the world. Now, that degree doesn't guarantee you a job now. The
Of
environment
course.
is very different, but
Mm.
it's still something that you can show that I have achieved something. And the other thing that Trinidad has is a very strong technical education sector. Welding, um,
Carpentry, plumbing.
carpentry, automotive repair.
Mm.
Really top rate institutions to teach people these things. And it helped also feed into our oil industry, where our need for skilled labor was very, very high. So Trinidad has a very interesting mix of both academic institutions and very, very good technical institutions. It's up to you whether you take the training that's there. Um, and it is available, it is heavily subsidized, and it is relatively affordable. And that really has been something that got us out of poverty in Trinidad, at least for the Indian population. This is not to say that poverty doesn't exist, it does. And I think the other thing that was a very much part of a push in that direction was relatively stable family units,
Right.
right? Even if the father was a waste of time, the grandparents were there. And that again persisted in rural Trinidad, where most of us still live, actually, including me. But in urban Trinidad, that family unit began to break down. So you found Afro Trinidadian youth who were up to the 1950s, 1960s, at least on par educationally with Trinidadian Indians, at least on par, if not better, starting to slip behind. And by the 1980s, a big gap had emerged. And actually, what is more frightening is this is more true for Afro Trinidadian boys than Afro Trinidadian girls. Afro Trinidadian girls have done quite well in academics and quite well educationally, and are very often, you know, way ahead of Afro Trinidadian boys in competence, ability, in every sense of the word. You're seeing this across the board. Let's be honest. I mean, boys are slipping behind educationally relative to girls, but in Trinidad, it's very stark. We are seeing this chasm opening up in some areas. Among Indians too. I mean, Indo-Trinidadian women are better educated than Indo-Trinidadian men by and large. And in fact, at the University of the West Indies, women from Indian Trinidadian backgrounds are the largest single group at the University of the West Indies.
There are some takeaways here that are it's impossible to ignore them. Education is very important, and it cannot be overstated. It may sound like it's common sense or it's
Yeah.
obvious, but it's not necessarily the case everywhere. And that is something that we need to very point that out. What I'm trying to say is really pay attention to studies, to education. It is not a panacea. I don't know if that's
Yeah.
necessarily okay. Panacea. Okay,
I see.
it is not necessarily the thing that will solve all your problems, but is it? But it's still a very important tool to have. And also for context, for people that don't know, Indians in general, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. You you have grandparents, you have parents, and then you have their children in the same house.
Well, I think that's really changed quite a lot.
That has
Uh,
changed.
yeah, it has changed largely because houses weren't big enough after a while.
Mm.
But for a long time that was the case. So, um, each generation would build on the one before it. It was easier to build one on top of the other. As families, got bigger, the nuclear family, the mother, father, children, was a core unit. And gradually the grandparents lived close by, but not in the same house. And again, I can only speak to Trinidadians, Indo-Trinidadians, and to some extent Indo-Guyanese and Indo-Surinamese.
Hmm.
But it's really, it wasn't always practical. I mean, my grandparents lived in the same house as we did. My father's parents and my mother's parents lived, similarly with her brother. But that became less common as time went on. What it did mean, though, is that
Hmm.
grandparents were involved in the grandchildren's lives. So if both parents needed to work, grandparents would often pitch in to help with kids, or relatives would pitch in to help with kids to make sure that if the mother needed to work as well, um, and very often Indo-Trinidadian mothers work, there'd always be someone looking out for the kids. So the children were never left unsupervised. The
No,
community was there.
and what you said, that's very important, and that's a comment you made earlier. Even if your dad is good for nothing,
Yeah,
you have your granddad there, and that is such an important. How do we put this? It's just a supportive environment.
yeah, and you need that supportive environment for any society to really thrive, and especially young boys have a positive male role model somewhere. If
Right.
it's not your father, it's your uncle, or your grandfather. And even if your father is not a perfect individual, I mean, alcoholism is the bane of Trinidadian Indian men. Alcoholism is very common.
Mm.
He may be an alcoholic, but he still wants you not to be one. He wants you to be better than him. So even with all his flaws, he wants you to be better than him. He says, "I didn't do anything in school. You need to do something in school." Right? Even if you're not good enough to get it into university, at least do something. And what you then found was that parents who were laborers would have children graduating from university. And this is not uncommon, it is quite common. It is to this day very common to have parents who are semi literate or only went to elementary school. Now that children are lawyers, doctors, engineers. Uh, Thanks in part to a very subsidized education system, but thanks also to the fact that they can be pushed. You get a good push from your parents to succeed.
Right.
Um,
There is a what's there is a stereotype associated with most Asian
yeah,
countries, and that's discipline and hard work, and that's also very important. It cannot be
I mean,
overstated.
it cannot be. I mean, it's not to say that these societies are perfect. There are problems within
Of
those,
course.
but discipline and hard work is something that is often appreciated and respected, even among populations that are poor and haven't achieved what they could. They've always been this desire for the next generation to do a bit better. And again, in Trinidad, where you have the population evenly divided between Africans and Indians, which is pretty much where it is, you saw that difference. So you effectively had two societies operating a little bit apart from each other, operating maybe with the same amount of money, but living two completely different sets of lifestyles and opportunities. And again, this plays directly into what happened in 1990, where
Hmm.
you had the urban population being much more heavily affected by what was going on. And you had the growth of this Islamist group, which promised to be a populist black liberation group on one hand and an Islamic group on the other hand. And in between was running its organized crime operations.
Right. So when you're talking about urban context, and that's very interesting and important. We're talking about, so we were pointing out the importance of education and family, strong family values.
Yeah,
You're seeing the corrosion of those two things in the urban context.
yeah.
What do you think is the explanation or explanations for this occurring in urban context?
That's a hard one to say because in Trinidad
Yeah.
it really should not have happened quite so easily. Um, I think two things started to happen. The first is, excuse me, a lot of young men started to take no responsibility for their kids. And the other thing that happened was the growth of communities in urban Trinidad, where essentially they lived off government, what I would call make work schemes. I mean, schemes that have really no economic value but are just there to give work to people. And in so doing, what happened was there was a corrosion of a culture of a work ethic. And this then led to women having to work several jobs to make ends meet at one end, and combine that with the fact that fathers weren't taking their responsibilities that seriously. You had this entire underclass of young men growing up, and once it starts, it's hard to stop. So you find you have a middle class Afro Trinidadian home that is so far removed from a lower socioeconomic group Afro Trinidadian home that is really not funny. In the middle class home, you have father, mother, okay, kids, some level of discipline, some level of in parental involvement in the school's life, and then you have this, working class grouping where you didn't have any of that, and the boys began to drop out of school at an alarming rate. The girls, those who didn't, who were unlucky, went into, they began the cycle of teenage pregnancies and what have you. And I mean, it was a very sudden and very shocking development. I think in part it was because of the economic downturn of the 1980s. I think also it was set in place before that, by schemes that were guaranteed to kill ambition. You had, you had, you know, there was a famous program called DUDE, Development, and I can't remember the acronym, but DUDE work in Trinidad and Tobago was renowned for actually doing no work whatsoever but getting money for doing nothing. And this was quite widely used in urban areas simply to give some money to government supporters. But in doing so, what they did was kill a community, kill a society, and kill ambition. And once you do that, there's very little hope to pull something back easily.
Mm.
And that led to a lot of that happening there. And I mean, it's gotten worse. I can only say this, it's gotten worse. I mean, Trinidad's inner cities now are in a bad shape.
All
Really,
right.
really bad shape.
There are some things that you're saying that I completely agree with. Totally understand what you're saying, and I do think that family values, it doesn't have to be even a religious thing.
Yeah.
This is commonplace. You don't have to be a Christian, you don't have to be Hindu or whatever to know that mom and dad are very important in your life.
Mm-hmm.
And whatever, and if something happens that is corrosive to that nuclear family, is gonna impact negatively on your life. You don't have to be a rocket
Yeah,
scientist or be of any particular religion to know that. And
exactly.
also, there's an education side of things that is also very important, and these things should be able to bring you to a better place in society, not just
Yeah.
economically but also
Mhm.
culturally, because you have more education. You should be a better informed person, making more informed decisions, participating in democratic life, and so on. But there are some people who might hear what you are saying and I am saying, because I do agree with that. It might be, oh, he's putting the Indian side on a better light, and not, and even though you are making objective observations.
Yeah, that's a legitimate point. And
Right.
here's the thing I would say. Always remember this: the Indians came into Trinidad at the absolute bottom of society. Our marriages were not recognized until 1946.
Hmm.
In other words, all Trinidadian Indians born in Trinidad between 1845 and 1946 were illegitimate children. They were not recognized in the eyes of the law as having the same property rights or the same inheritance rights as children who were born into Christian families. So we came in at the bottom of the scale. So we've seen what could go wrong, and we also know where we were in the 1940s. If you were to look at the prison population in Trinidad, disproportionately there were a very high percentage of Indians in it. But then the breakout happened in the 1940s. The breakout happened. We started to settle down. Education was pushed. More schools were built in our areas. Many of these schools were built by our own people, and kids began getting educated. Girls began getting educated, and the society began to change. During this time, the Afro Trinidadians had the opportunity of education and so on. And for a long time, they were actually the middle class of Trinidad and Tobago. It is when that began to break down for whatever reason, and I strongly suspect it was the period 1970s to 1980s where the decline began to happen, and then accelerated after that. That you saw the breakdown of the family unit in urban Trinidad. Once that happened, it's hard to pull that back. You saw the same thing happening in the city United States.
Mm-hmm.
Up to the 1950s, Afro Americans were generally nuclear families,
Oh
tried to be as
yes.
ambitious as they could be. Um, I would say culturally fairly conservative.
Mm-hmm.
That changed in the 1960s. From the 1960s onwards, that began a significant shift in urban Afro American culture. You started to see a breakdown of the nuclear family. You started to see, and that is very much mirrored with what happened here. And some people say it was Johnson's welfare state that caused it. I'm not entirely sure I agree with that. But I do know in Trinidad, our make work welfare schemes, because I have to use welfare in inverted commas because I'm not sure how much welfare was done at all, helped create a big problem. And when the money to support those schemes was not there by the 1980s, thanks to our own mismanagement, let's be very clear. No one is to blame for Trinidad's fate except Trinidad.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the IMF, it's not the United States, it's not anybody. We messed up big time. And when we went through a bad patch in the 80s, we couldn't sustain a lot of these programs. The net result was people looked for another influence, but they also saw this rising criminality with the narcotics trade.
Hmm.
And the narcotics trade, everything it touched went bad. So whether it was the police, they went bad. Judiciary, they went bad. Um, the respect for civil society, that went through. They saw this class of criminals coming up who seemed to be untouchable, who, and don't get me wrong, I mean, every racial group was involved in that class of narcotic smuggling
Mm-hmm.
in
Mm-hmm.
one way, shape, or form. Indians, white Trinidadians, Afro Trinidadians, everybody was involved. But in inner city youth, largely Afro Trinidadian, they became part of the muscle used by gangs to facilitate this activity, right? So there was that was there.
Okay.
And
No, no. I'm just making it clear that some people would hear what you're
yeah,
saying and be like, "Oh, he's racist," or "Oh, he's like portraying the blacks in a negative light," or so on. And listen, I don't agree with that. I agree with what you're saying. I
yeah,
think that we have to be objective and see the problems that we have and their origins, and it doesn't matter at the end of the day, because I think that some people are just so quick to make
yeah.
those sorts of
I
comments.
think that's true. I will say this though. I mean, within Trinidadian society itself, we've had those honest discussions
Mm,
because people see it. You know, Trinidad's education system
mm,
tends to publicize success. So when the list of scholarship winners, when the lists of people who have done well in examinations comes out, and there is this apparent racial tilt one way, or when the list of university graduates comes out, people see it and people accept it for what it is. What is less, what has to be made very clear here is that places like Trinidad are uniquely placed because we really have made a lot of efforts to make education accessible. What is unfortunate is that we have had problems making it work. And we've had the other problem is that when we started to see the decline in urban areas, we did nothing to arrest it. And I will say this, as anybody will rightly tell you, there is no difference fundamentally in the abilities of an Indian or an African or a white person or anybody.
Uh-huh.
There's
Uh-huh.
no difference in ability. There's no difference in anything. Given the same opportunities, the same socio-economic stability, they have a big chance of success. But the issue of socio-economic stability, and this is why I emphasize the breakdown of those make work schemes and those welfare schemes,
Mm-hmm.
those schemes were less available to Indians, but it also meant that Indians were less dependent on them. So when they were cut, it's not to say Indians didn't have a problem. Indians had a big problem. Suicide rates spiked among Indians. But among the urban areas, the loss of those welfare schemes was devastating to some people. And you have to see the conditions of urban inner cities in Trinidad relative to the affluence that is around it, and you have to see how was this allowed to happen. How was
Um,
this allowed to happen? Because it should never have happened this way. We always had enough resources to deal with things, and we just squandered them. And
Given the economic context that we live in, namely capitalism,
yeah,
although it may be that that's changing as everything does, and I'm talking about, for instance, some thinkers that are talking about some new age of techno feudalism. That's another completely different matter. But we are inside this economic structure called capitalism. For good or for bad, that's another conversation. But given the current conditions, I believe that it is very fair to conclude that whenever you engage people or communities in living off of welfare states or providing them a lot, what you are going to create is conformity.
well, I don't know if Trinidad has ever conformed, and Trinidadians conform to anything. At least in our case, that has never happened. Uh, I mean, well, it's hard to say that
But it
there's
takes
no
away the ambition, is what you're saying.
yeah, it takes away ambition, but ambition and conformity are two different things. Um, I really think in Trinidad, what it did was take
Mm,
away the fire of young, and principally young men. I mean, young women, young Afro Trinidadian women are pretty ambitious. I
mm.
can't say otherwise. It took away the ambition of young men to achieve anything. It was, and that was a very sad indictment. And added to that is that they did not see,
Mm.
without a very strong family structure, they did not see a positive role model that will tell them, even if your father was, say, a dock worker, okay, father had a stable wage, father was skilled or semi-skilled, he would provide a positive role model for you and say, okay, look, I'm working on the docks transporting, lifting goods to these ships. I want you to go to school, and maybe you could do something better than me. You could become an artificer, a skilled worker. You could become a welder. You could become a skilled mason. You could become a mechanic. If you want to go further, you could become a teacher. You could become a doctor.
Improve your material.
Yeah, and improve that. And while that was very much part of society across the boards up to the 50s and 60s, it really isn't there anymore. And we saw the the decline of our society very quickly. Let me be very clear about my own community. I'm seeing signs of that rot happening in certain sections of the Indian society as well in Trinidad. where you're seeing those elements that have taken to, depending on what passes for the welfare state in Trinidad, which have taken to thinking that responsibility towards your kids is something that is to be taken lightly, and not encouraging education or ambition. You're seeing the same results happen there. So it's a matter of it's not a matter of it's a matter of communities realizing, hey, stop, we have to do something differently, or we have to do something right as opposed to wrong. But again, I can't, the point about this is the family unit is valuable, because I mean, uh, I've known situations where, in my practice as a lawyer, and you see this all the time in the family courts, the parents are unstable. Alcohol, sometimes their lifestyle isn't good. The grandparents step in, and they say the kid has to go to school. It has, certain things have to be done. You don't see the same level of intervention in urban areas. And because of the way Trinidad is divided, the urban areas are largely of Afro Trinidadian, as opposed to the rural areas, which are Indo Trinidadian. It's not because the rural areas are any paragon of virtue. It's just that the family unit has remained a little stronger there, which has prevented the rot. Uh, we're no paragons of virtue or anything of the sort. It's simply that things worked out differently. A simple thing like this, that when things were really bad during COVID, I mean, really bad during COVID, and everything was closing down, despite the fact that a lot of people in rural Trinidad could not go to work because the small businesses where they worked were closed and had no income, the family unit and the village unit kept things going. Food was shared. You found they had a little piece of land, they'd plant crops on it, then they'd sell it, uh, you know, you know, and that sort of stuff. So community matters. When community breaks down, you have a problem. What happened in urban areas, and we're paying a heavy price for it today, is the family unit broke down and was replaced by the gang. The gang is the family. The gang becomes the father figure. The gang leader becomes the father figure. Never
And I
mind the fact that gang leaders are exploiting those young kids like no tomorrow and are making an absolute fortune. They are the father figures. They're the ones telling those kids, look, I'm going to give you a sense of purpose. Never mind that purpose is to go and kill somebody.
Mhm.
But I'm giving you a sense of purpose. I'm giving you a sense of direction. I'm giving you a sense of worth. And I mean, I come full circle to 1990. Whatever else I think about Abu Bakr, I have to say he did exactly that.
He
He was
provided a
somebody,
role model.
he was very much, and he was, I mean, Bakr, it is hard to say how charismatic Abu Bakr really was.
Hmm.
He was astonishingly charismatic. He spoke well. He articulated what people thought were legitimate fears and legitimate concerns. He garbed himself in the robes of a liberator, of a person who was against oppression, who was against racism, who was against discrimination. And he always spoke in those terms. Always spoke in those terms. Whether he believed it or not is hard for me to say. But he always spoke in those terms. And when one thing led to another, and 1990 happened, Bakr always maintained that he was a liberator. I'm still trying to figure out how he liberated anybody on that day, but that's how he portrayed it. And his son still speaks in those terms. But the truth is very different, of course. The truth was that he staged a violent uprising, and people died. A lot of people lost everything in the fires and the looting and the rampages that took place. And we've never had a reckoning for it.
Hmm. What were the political goals of Imam
Yasin, Yasin,
Jassim
Abu
Jassim
Bakr.
Abu Bakr? What were the political aims of
It
him
was
and
to
his
replace.
group?
It was to replace the government of the day.
Uh-huh.
The government of the day, as I mentioned earlier, had lost a lot of its legitimacy. It had been elected, incidentally, in a landslide in 1986. By 1990, it was that election was the political entity was a coalition of middle class, uh, African, mixed race, and some working class elements, and an Indian middle class working class alliance. So it was a multiracial entity. But in negotiations for the seat shares of people, the then Prime Minister A.N.R. Robinson became extremely arrogant. And what ended up happening is when he started to face some pushback for things that were being done, he chose to throw out all those who represented the Indian electorate in Trinidad, who had legitimacy among them at any rate. He kept some, but he removed those with real legitimacy. So the bulk of his Indian support, which was very important to keeping that coalition going, fell apart. Economic policies hurt the working and middle class Afro Trinidadian in a very serious way. It hurt Indo Trinidadians too. But remember, we were often self employed. So we got hurt in a different way. If you're a government employee and your salary gets cut, you're in more trouble than if you're self employed in some ways. Okay? So people were hurting a lot with the economic policies. And then you had simultaneously a breakdown of the security apparatus.
Mm-hmm.
The police were increasingly viewed as, well, the police were never viewed as competent to begin with, but it got worse. Corruption was endemic. The military was in a state of utter disrepair, to the extent there wasn't enough food to feed duty personnel. The military had to be sent home half day at some times because there wasn't enough food, there wasn't enough money to feed them rations. Uh, Total disrepair of vehicles and that sort of stuff. So all this was happening, and Bakar was slowly building up his list of grievances. So his political was to overthrow the government and to appoint a government where he would be Minister of National Security, and there would be this coalition entity that is there pending new elections. And that was his objective.
Mm.
And he thought he would get support for it. What ended up happening was a little more complicated. Bakar's plan seems to have been to seize Parliament, seize the main radio and television stations, and then seize the airport, roughly at the same time. Well, the seizure of Parliament went off pretty smoothly. There were a handful of government ministers who escaped, but most of them were taken prisoner. The seizure of radio and telecommunications took place very quickly. Those places were completely unprotected. The airport, on the other hand, there are a set of stories that are going around there in that that a team was being sent to the airport to seize the airport, but they got a flat tire on the way and reached late, by which time the Trinidad and Tobago Coast Guard Air Wing had taken charge of the airport, and they were
Mm.
armed. So that never happened. The other story is that they just didn't plan properly in the first place. But they thought that they would take these entities hostage, move the hostages somewhere else, and in so doing create a situation where they were able to bargain for whatever they needed. What actually happened was a little weirder than that. They were counting on support from within the Trinidad and Tobago regiment, the military. And there are rumors that the regiment had some sympathy with Bakar. So at least one or two military officers had sympathy with Bakar. That did not come to fruition. And the military was able to mobilize very, very quickly in terms of pulling personnel together. And the military at the time was about 1,000 strong. They were able to pull 400 personnel together within a matter of hours to try and figure out what was going on. Now, when I say they were able to pull personnel together, I literally mean pull personnel together. It doesn't mean they were able to give them weapons. It doesn't mean they were able to issue ammunition. It doesn't mean they were able to do anything. But while all this was happening, the Trinidad and Tobago police service in the capital city collapsed. Their main headquarters was blown up. The police were unable to offer any resistance. Several police officers were killed, including a young man on sentry duty who was, gunned down in cold blood. Um, so for a while, Bakar and them seemed to be succeeding. But by late evening, the Trinidad and Tobago Regiment was able, excuse me, was able to muster about 22 men in a sub-strength platoon and send them into the capital city. They were able to bluff a much larger force of insurgents into thinking they were a much larger unit.
Okay, there's something I'd like to
Shoot.
clarify for not just for me but for the
Yeah,
audience.
sure.
So far, you're talking about the political aims, which is what I asked
Yeah.
of Yassin Abu Bakr. Where does the religion come into play?
Well, the
What is the
religion,
religious
yeah, I'm
aspect?
glad you said that. Now, whether Bakr intended to establish an Islamic state or anything, I don't think he ever thought that far.
Mm.
Largely because Bakr knows Trinidad is a very multi-religious state. I mean, Trinidad is, if you go by the last census, maybe 57% of people say they're Christian, another 20% say they're Hindu, 11% say they're nothing at all, 5 to 8% say they're Muslim. So it's a very multi-religious state. So I think what he used Islam for was two things.
Mm-hmm.
One, getting resources from Gaddafi.
Oh, okay,
And
I see.
two, creating that family of loyal supporters motivated by something more than a paycheck. Because the Muslimin troops, for all their multiple failings, no one has said they misbehaved with any civilian hostages, especially women. They didn't misbehave with the women. They didn't steal money from them. Right? They behaved with a certain level of discipline. And I think part of that was their religious upbringing. Part of that was that. This doesn't mean they behaved particularly well with the parliamentarians. They shot several, they beat several. But at the radio station and at television house, they did not harm anybody. They went out of their way to protect hostages where they thought they were in danger. And while they were not, nice, they were not particularly cruel. And no one who was a hostage there spoke of them as behaving anything other than properly. And I think that was part of his of the Islamic part to them, that there was a sense of discipline and of family. This didn't translate necessarily into fighting effectiveness because, from all accounts, they were pretty useless.
Okay, you do talk about the TTDF, which is the
Yeah,
Trinidad and Tobago Defense Force, and
yeah,
you describe it particularly as opposed to the insurrectionists.
yeah.
Um, in general, can you tell us more about the TTDF around this time?
Sure,
Because it wasn't
sure.
numerous, it wasn't necessarily a military. There was, yeah.
Okay, the TTDF around that time was, first of all, I think this is an interesting point to note. The TTDF then and now draws its manpower principally from the same areas the gangs draw their manpower from. It's the same urban Afro-Trinidadian youth who form the bulk of the Trinidad and Tobago Defense Force, then as now, right? So from the same neighborhoods that you get gangs, you get soldiers,
Mm.
right? And it's led to some crossover because some soldiers become criminals. Equally, a lot of soldiers try to be a good role model in their communities and come under fire from the gangs. And this was true then and it is true now. So their recruiting base was there. They Trinidad and Tobago Defense Force prides itself on having a decent standard of training, which it does, a decent standard of discipline. Its officer corps is reasonably well educated, well led. Um, while the Trinidad and Tobago Defense Force is overwhelmingly Afro Trinidadian, it's well over 90% Afro Trinidadian. I can tell you that the Trinidad and Tobago Defense Force does not think of itself in racial terms at all.
Mm-hmm.
No matter what your racial or religious background is, the Defense Force will respect it. And that was true then, and it's true now. Uh, so while it is very much skewed racially in one direction, its behavior has always been that of a group that does not think of itself as being exclusively of representing one group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And in 1990, the big problem they had was an extremely bad state of repair. Vehicles weren't working. The Trinidad and Tobago Coast Guard, which was arguably in the best shape of any unit, had only 3 vessels operational, one of which was on one engine, and another one, the hull was so thin that people were afraid to go to sea in it. What was extremely bad was communication between the units. So one of the things that happened on the night of 27th July is the Trinidad and Tobago Coast Guard didn't know what the hell was going on. The regiment never told them. So they were thinking that their main base would come under attack. So they spent a lot of time trying to fortify the base and pull weapons out of storage, set up roadblocks, only to find out that the regiment was still in the field and was quite prepared to take the fight into the capital city. Excuse me. One of the things that the Trinidad and Tobago Regiment had going for it was very substantial ammunition stocks. So when they got their act together, they were able to completely outgun the opposition within a matter of moments. They had no shortage of ammunition, they had no shortage of supplies. What they had a shortage of was vehicles. So even then, what ended up happening, and this is, when I think back on it, because I was a kid in 1990, I was 17, and thinking about it then and looking at the video footage and then learning what happened, it was quite remarkable what happened. The army didn't have enough trucks, it didn't have enough jeeps, it didn't have enough of anything. The public utilities, the electricity company, the water company said, take our vehicles, go ahead and use them. So you found the Trinidad and Tobago Defense Force got a lot of help from other public sector entities, and it got a lot of help from the general public. Guys would lend them trucks, they would lend them vehicles, they would lend them supplies, and so they were able to generate an enormous amount of goodwill by simply remaining loyal to the government of the day. The other thing the regiment did on that night of the 27th was find every single surviving member of the civilian government that was not being held hostage and start cobbling together a government outside with legitimacy. So the TTDF's loyalty to the Constitution guided all of its actions. And while the two main personnel at that time, Colonel Joseph Theodore, later became a brigadier, and Ralph Brown, later became a major general, both of them have now passed on. They didn't like each other or get along with each other, but they understood that their loyalty was to the Constitution. And very early on, that was the only thing in their minds, to get a civilian government in place and to take orders from a legitimate authority.
Mm.
And it's hard to say the impact that has had on at least my viewing of the regiment and of the fact that it saved the democracy of Trinidad and Tobago. Because, I think of it, the parliament was held hostage. The bulk of the opposition was inside there. The bulk of the government was inside there. The Jamaat al-Muslimin had 114 armed men at Parliament and at the main broadcasting houses. The Trinidad and Tobago Regiment had 22 men in place on the night of the 27th of July, later joined by another 30, I should point out, but they bluffed a much larger Muslim force into remaining in place. And they turned a hostage situation into a siege situation from which the Muslimin couldn't win.
There seems to be a lack of, and you do point out that the Muslimin were not necessarily a rebel, but that they had some sort of training.
Yeah.
But there seems to be a lack of strategic thinking, because how else would you expect this to end if you are holding only holding hostages, and you have what is perceived to be a higher force against you, at least in the beginning, as you're pointing out.
Yeah.
So what exactly was the strategic thinking going on that side?
That is where, excuse me, that is where, since 1990 to date, no one can figure out what their strategic thought was.
Mm.
It is believed, now I can't say this to be 100% true, but it was believed that they thought that elements of the regiment, the military, would join them, that there would be a popular uprising, and that they would be legitimized as being able to form this coalition government, removing an unpopular government. Well, it didn't quite happen that way. The government was unpopular. It remained unpopular. The regiment, however, did not come over to them. And while there was a popular uprising, the popular uprising took place to do only one thing, and that was to loot every store in Port of Spain and set it on fire. And that looting continued for a couple of days. But in reality, there was very little political support for them, and there was a lot of opportunistic looting.
Mm.
And what that did was turn any sense of anger towards the government of the day into a huge amount of anger against the Jamaat al-Muslimin. What they thought strategically is nobody's entirely sure. I mean, to give you an idea of how little thought they put into it, they ran out. They had no food.
Hmm.
So they brought a lot of ammunition, a lot of grenades, a lot of rifles to the game. But by the night of the 27th of July, they would have had nothing to eat. Their personnel were poorly trained relative to the military.
Mm-hmm.
They they found themselves completely outthought, completely outmaneuvered. And the fact is, the first, I mean, this is a story. This is something that I'd like to place on record. Captain Clark and Major Peter Joseph. Major Peter Joseph later went on to reach the rank of Major General. They were real heroes on that night because they went in knowing that the Muslimin had superior numbers. And they knew they had 22 men with them. And they completely outmaneuvered and bluffed the Muslimin into a position where the Muslimin could not win until reinforcements could come up. They were completely outthought. The strategic objective of the Jamaat is still something I cannot figure out what they were thinking. Now they are still of the view, those who still survive, saying that look, they struck a blow against an unpopular government. They struck a blow where they allowed the poor, deprived youth of the inner cities to loot Port of Spain. I don't think that has a lot of traction in the general public's mind. They see destruction. They saw a lot of death. 24 people died. And I should point out, not one of the people who was killed by the military. They were all killed by the Jamaat.
Hmm.
And these are 24 innocent people. These were people with not, people walking down the street, people, one police sentry on duty, that sort of thing. A member of parliament was shot and killed. What did it achieve? Nothing.
Um, what was the public's perception during this
Okay,
insurrection?
right now that's where it gets interesting.
Right.
That's where it gets really interesting because when it happened, to the eternal, I don't know. Don't want to say eternal shame, but it's indicative of the mood at the time. A fair number of Trinidadians said, "Well, the only mistake Mr. Bakar made was not killing the prime minister when he had the chance."
Okay.
Right? I'm sorry to say that, but that was a much more widely held view than
Right.
people
Right.
think. So people were in two minds. One, absolute fear of what the Muslimin would do because nobody thought the Muslimin was good. We had all heard the rumors about their crime elements. We all heard the elements of their brutality, this sort of thing. On the other hand, excuse me, the unpopularity of the government of the day, the government of then Prime Minister A.N.R. Robinson, was extremely high. And while Robinson displayed quite exemplary courage under almost, horrible conditions, nobody cared. Nobody really cared very much for his government. And while, it ended in, 6 days later, the hostages were released, everybody was okay, and it came to an end. The government was so unpopular. It went from a strength of 33 seats in a 36-seat parliament to two in an election held about 1 year later. So the perception of it at the time was the Muslimin did something very wrong, was very bad. It was not a good thing. An elected government was being overthrown. That's not good. But at the same time, if you did it, you might as well do it right. Get rid of the guy,
Hmm.
get rid of the prime minister, and maybe you'd have a chance at getting back some level of sense. But again, that reflected a very, very cynical mood at the time in Trinidad. I mean, it was really it was very cynical and very bitter towards that government of the day. And I think it is only in retrospect where we're able to sit back and think clearly about what happened. And we could put aside our bitterness about the government of the day and think about what 1990 represented. 1990 represented a very frontal assault on our democratic principles. That no matter how much you may hate a government, the way to get rid of it is through the ballot box, not through the bullet. This is something Trinidadians have held dear since first elections were held in Trinidad in 1945. This is not something we do, but it happened. And I think on reflection,
Hmm.
we recognize that we came very close in 1990 and that in reality we owe a debt of gratitude to the military for remaining steadfast to the Constitution. We remain also very grateful to the fact that Trinidad is fundamentally an extremely resilient country. That even with the economy not so good, that even with things not being great, Trinidad has an amazing capacity to recover. Its people are fundamentally hardworking and capable of making self-sacrifices for their families and for the greater good sometimes. Um, I think what is not so good is that we've lost a lot of the lessons from 1990. From a military perspective, no proper after action reports were created. So we never looked carefully at the problems we face there. And the other thing, which has come back to bite not only Trinidad but the wider world, is that we didn't take the opportunity to destroy the Jamaat al-Muslimin as an ideological force. Because what happened after that, after the court cases, after the and those of you who in your wider audience, the Muslimin were actually granted an amnesty
Hmm.
for their actions as part of the hostage deal. The government of the day believed that amnesty was not valid because it was done under duress. Well, surprise, surprise, somehow or the other, the Trinidadian judiciary found that the amnesty was in fact valid. So the Muslimin was set free. And while the highest appellate court did eventually find that the amnesty was in fact not valid, by that time the Muslimin had been free for so many years, they said it would have been an abusive process to arrest them again. So the Jamaat al-Muslimin, killing 24 people, burning half of Port of Spain to the ground, creating pure hell, got away scot-free.
Hmm.
And I think that came back to haunt us big time.
Right, which is why you were making the comment, and you also put that in the book, that it's still the country that's supporting ISIS the most
Yeah,
on the Western
in the
Hemisphere.
Western Hemisphere. The Jamaat al-Muslimin lost a lot of its muscle and its might in the 2000s. It still existed. It still had a lot of influence. It was used as political muscle by all political parties in Trinidad and Tobago. It still had its organized crime element. But with the rise of Al Qaeda, with the rise of radical Islam around the world, what the Jamaat led to was a number of splinter organizations coming off. And these groups, some of them openly supported Al Qaeda, at least psychologically approved of the September 11 attacks in the United States. But where it really came into its own was when ISIS emerged. And a lot of these front organizations switched from simply being, you know, religiously inspired organized crime units to becoming recruitment grounds for ISIS and supplying fighters to ISIS and supplying and inspiring whole families to pick up themselves and go to Syria and Iraq and support ISIS. And that ultimately was the legacy of 1990.
Hmm.
Something that was totally reprehensible. I mean, there is nothing that could ever justify support for ISIS. I mean, I'm no friend of the Assad government, and I don't particularly think much of the Iraqi government right now anyway. But ISIS was pure, unadulterated evil. And you had Trinidadians who breathed the same air as I did, who, ate the same food as I did, more or less, who lived under the same country that I did, which, for all Trinidad's flaws, it respects people's religious rights, it respects their democratic rights, it respects our civil rights. It's not a place where you're going to get tortured. It's not a place where you're going to get arrested for speaking out against the government. I would have been arrested many years ago. You take this country that's fundamentally a liberal democracy,
Hmm.
and you go to support ISIS. It's something that on at one level you can't understand. But when you start looking back at the Jamaat and its evolution and its offshoots, you see where the inspiration came from. And I think ultimately that was the legacy of 1990.
Hmm.
Trinidad recovered from 1990. The Trinidad and Tobago Defense Force, unfortunately, took fewer lessons than I would like from it. A lot of the men who played a very pivotal role in 1990 went on to become quite senior officers. Excuse me. But the fact that we could have faced, or we could even still face, ISIS returnees coming back, that we could face people now who have fought military institutions way above ours, who are capable of acts of violence, the likes of which we have not seen. This is something I don't think we've given enough thought to. And, it's really quite unfortunate that we've allowed that to happen, because we could have stopped those people going up to Iraq or Syria. We could have done something, but we didn't do anything. And I speak with some feeling there because I was in the Ministry of National Security at the time. We saw these things happening. We didn't do enough. So, I
And
mean,
that is a teaching from history.
yeah,
That
because
is a
we
lesson.
really could have done something. I mean, we had signs. I mean, all that's going on in Venezuela now. Chavez this was the final years of Chavez's life, and Maduro was now coming into Venezuela, we had a good relationship with SEBIN. SEBIN picked up a number of Islamists who they thought were dangerous. That's Venezuelan intelligence. SEBIN arrested them, charged them. They ended up pleading guilty. But that was a wake-up call for us that they were prepared to go overseas. And, these are things that there are a lot of lessons, not just for Trinidad, but for
The region.
the region, the interconnectivity of the region.
Hmm.
The fact is we have relative ease of movement. The fact is that, um, you know, people with a Trinidadian passport can get visas and get access to many places without too much of a problem. The fact that Trinidad is still a relatively affluent country where people can afford tickets to travel relatively easily compared to some other places, it leads to a lot of potential damage. It leads to a lot of potential concerns. And
All
that's
right.
something I don't think we've actually appreciated enough.
Okay. Two more things.
Sure.
What happened to Yassin Abu Bakr, and what are some of the myths that still persist to this day about the insurrection of 1990?
Okay. Well, Abu Bakr, after the court cases and his acquittal, remained influential within, I'd say, the political organized crime elements of Trinidad.
Hmm.
His support was used for electoral muscle and a little bit of mild voter intimidation by political parties. But he principally remained a organized crime figure. Bakr's influence began to wane as other more radical elements came into being, especially post excuse me, especially post 9/11. Bakr later died peacefully, and so Bakr is no more. His son is still active in politics. His son is not anything like his father in terms of competence, charisma, ability. But he is active in politics. He's formed a political party, has managed to lose his deposit in every election he has fought to date. But, good on him. He's part of the democratic process. Um, what are some of the myths? I think the first myth that happened that is still there is that somehow or the other the coup was allowed to happen by external players. I'm pretty certain that that wasn't the case. Nobody anticipated something of this scale would happen. If it's anything, you can legitimately cast aspersions on the competence of Trinidad and Tobago's police special branch, which is our only intelligence service. And if you ever met its personnel, you'd know why it happened. I mean, these guys weren't particularly competent. Another myth is that the Jamaat al-Muslimin had support from the political opposition. In all my time looking at this, is then while the opposition had nothing good to say about the government of the day, there's no evidence that they supported the Jamaat al-Muslimin. They knew Bakr, they were on good terms with him in some ways, but there was no evidence that they supported the coup or aided or abetted it in any way, shape, or form. The other myth is one that the Muslimin tries to inculcate, that somehow they struck this great blow for freedom and um, against oppression by the capitalist class. Capitalist class came out of this just fine. It's all the workers who were working for the capitalist class that got laid off because the buildings were burned down, the businesses were destroyed, and all that sort of stuff. So and I think there's another one in that the Muslimin was portrayed for a period of time as being able to completely outclass and outgun the Trinidad and Tobago military and Trinidad and Tobago police. This is a complete nonsense. The Trinidad and Tobago police found itself outgunned largely because of bad leadership and because in 1990 the average policeman in Trinidad and Tobago still did not carry a gun. Right? So most policemen on duty that day were unarmed. But the police, had they armed themselves, would have completely outclassed the Muslim in terms of firepower. And as compared to the military itself, the Trinidad and Tobago military, then as now, is put is pretty much a full strength infantry unit with support weapons, mortars, machine guns, you name it, is there. So once the once they were able to bottle the Muslimin up, the coup was essentially over. There was no chance of a success. Um, I think, and I don't know if this is so much of a myth, I think one of the big fears I have is that because of the fundamental distaste for a lot of what was happening at the time, the socioeconomic things that were happening at the time, Bakar has, in some circles, emerged as a positive figure, and that 1990 was somehow something that was a necessary evil. I don't think there was anything necessary about 1990. I think there was everything evil about it. I think there was nothing necessary about it. Because what ended up happening is that despite any protestations that he was representing, oppressed youth, and believe me, those youth are oppressed by socioeconomic circumstances and what have you,
Mm-hmm.
his actions did nothing to help them whatsoever. And I think that's really the sad thing, is that we saw this incident happen. We saw the use of the urban youth as muscle for the agendas of Bakar and whoever else was with him. But ultimately, we did nothing to fix the problems of the youth in urban areas. We never addressed the issues of breakdown of family units, which we could have done something about. We never aggressively addressed social problems being faced by single mothers in the area, where
Mm.
we could have given them support, not just financial money, but but support to say, look, if you need somewhere to leave your children, we will have daycare centers. We'll have places where they could have positive influence. We did not invest enough into that. We did some investments later on, but it was too little, too late. We don't want to address the issue of children dropping out of school, and coming out of school with no qualifications whatsoever, coming out of school illiterate. That is something we could address. It's well within our means to address those things. And when that is disproportionately affecting one community and in one area, and in urban areas at that, where you are seeing side by side, you're seeing skyscrapers not 200 meters away from places without running water.
Mm-hmm.
And you know it's not because of poverty. It's not places like India where you see that happening, but you also know the people in the place without running water have a job to go to, and there's a family and this sort of thing. You're seeing the skyscraper here. A single mother raising a number of kids inside there has to work every hour of the day to make sure that they get food. Child is left unattended. Child is being sent to school, meets a gang leader on his way, decides not to go to school anymore. All of that we could have done something about. And what we did was not learn the lessons from 1990 in respect of our socioeconomic situation. And we counted on the relative economic growth of Trinidad. We counted on the educational opportunities that exist in theory, but did not address the societal breakdowns that were happening. And unless you address the societal breakdowns at community level that are happening, you will not be able to allow those kids to take advantage of the other things you are making available to them.
Mm. And these are conclusions you are making based on your academic training. From the result of getting war studies,
Well,
PhD.
it's that, and basically also the fact that I've practiced in the courts in Trinidad and Tobago for so long. I mean, and I've seen it. I mean, look, like it or hate it, Trinidadians, we're one people. And while we may have different races, different religions, that kid growing up in an inner city, in a city port of Spain, right, deserves every opportunity, deserves every chance at a success.
Mm-hmm,
As a
mm-hmm.
success, he has that potential, he has that right, he has that ability. I see no reason why we should not intervene as effectively as we can. Now, I would say the same thing if it was what regardless of race or religion of the children. Um, I'm afraid that once again Trinidad is seeing an underclass of young people growing up and allowing the gangs. Maybe it's not Baka this time. Maybe they're just pure criminal gangs. Um, to have their way. And in this sense, it's even worse now because Baka, for whatever it was, did try to instill some discipline in some of the young people. Can't deny that. Now you have people doing things that gangs in the past would never have done. I mean, Trinidad has become. I mean, this is an aside, but it is indirectly related to all of this. Trinidad is experiencing a crime wave the likes of which it has never seen before. Trinidad has been much poorer than this. It has gone through much worse economic times than this. But we are seeing a level of crime and violence that's unheard of. And the roots of this can indirectly be traced back to our failure to address issues that arose out of 1990.
Hmm.
And those issues are not simply the law enforcement, the courts, the police, the intelligence services. Those are important. But ultimately, it is to prevent kids from getting into the clutches of gangs. You cut off their supply of manpower, the gangs become far less powerful. And while they may still be able to do some wicked things, their reach is diminished, their impact is diminished. And we cannot have young people suffer because of our lack of willingness to intervene as effectively as we should.
You are making these comments, and again, you said that it's also because of your judiciary and expertise as a lawyer, also. What I wanted to get at is that, nonetheless, your formation in war studies,
Yeah.
military history, economy, and so on, has rendered you prepared to make these comments or to study these problems. And what I'm getting at with this is that it seems to me that in Latin America in general, there seems to be a prejudice against military history. What
That's
would you have to say to that? That's what I was
I
getting at.
think, well, let me put it this way: if there's a prejudice against military history, our entire region is doing ourselves a massive disservice. Let's take the issue of society and criminality out of it for a moment. Let us look at the fact that we do have a very rich military history. Whether you're looking at the wars of independence against Spain, whether you're looking at the Mexican Revolutionary Wars, whether you're looking at the conflicts that have taken place throughout Latin America, the men and women who fought those wars deserve to be remembered. The histories of those conflicts deserve to be remembered, deserve to be respected. Our countries, many of them served with the distinction during World Wars One and Two. And I mean, they had societal impacts. I mean, indentureship of Indians ended because of World War One. The end of the British Empire came about as a result of the end of World War Two, and we all played a part in that, directly or indirectly. We have a history that we should recognize, that we should learn about, we should celebrate, and we should reflect on. History isn't necessarily good or bad, it's simply there.
Hmm.
And our need to remember that history is something that I think we need to bear in mind. I mean, throughout the Caribbean, for example, you will find a rich history of, during the colonial era, from the coming of the British, the coming of the Spaniards, the Haitian Revolution. In Latin America, you have this incredible treasure trove of history dating back from the colonial era, and prior to that, to the Aztecs, the Incas, the Mayas. All of them have this incredible history for us to learn from. And what military history leads us to do is to examine conflicts, whether it's an internal conflict or an external conflict, from a number of perspectives. You look at it from the operational perspective, you look at it from the political perspective, you look at it from the societal perspective. I mean, the war of the Triple Alliance and its impact on Paraguay. I mean, you can't get away from that. I mean, Paraguay's population went right down, and it was rebuilt. Um, you look at the incredible waste that was the Chaco War in the 1930s.
Mm.
You look, but at the same time, you look at it from the wasteful impact. You look at it from the operational impact. You look at the political impact. All of this is interrelated, and it's worth studying. I mean, 1990 is a very minor conflict in the region, in terms of the region, but it had a huge impact for us, and it had a global impact because of what happened with ISIS. It behooves us to look at every conflict. It behooves us to look at our societies that produced those conflicts or participated in those conflicts, and to learn about them, to study them, and to appreciate them. And I don't think we do that enough. I will say, I will say this: Latin America is blessed with some of the finest military historians I've ever come across, and I would say that their work should be appreciated. I mean, Helian has published a lot of them, but from fellas like Mario Overal in Guatemala, who has written so much on the 100-hour war between Honduras and El Salvador, from
Mario
Santiago
who, I'm sorry?
Overall, Overall, from Guatemala, Santiago Rivas from Argentina. You have a very young man from Paraguay who is beyond brilliant. You have Amaru Tincopa, who has written on the Peruvian Ecuadorian conflicts. I mean, these men are absolutely brilliant. Um, and, they're incredible. Santiago Flores from Mexico. I mean, Santiago Flores' work as part of Mexican aviation history is amazing. I mean, I'm just in awe of how phenomenal he is. You're blessed with some amazing historians.
Hmm.
And I mean, and I draw this in distinction to Southern Asia, which is India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, those areas. And even though they have that rich history there, they have yet to produce the number and quality of military historians as Latin America has. Quality that exists now, we may wish for more, but there's such an amazing set of work that's being done already that we need to build on it, and we need to appreciate it, and we need to learn and live and work on it. That
Yes, but what I have noticed is that even though we may have those important military historians in our region and
Yeah,
in our part of the world, um, what I have noticed is that their works are mostly consumed and marketed for uh, the um, Britain, the United States, other places that aren't necessarily us,
yeah,
and
that's fair
that could
enough.
be a structural problem.
That is a structural problem. We need to facilitate more local publication. We need to facilitate more local work. Now, some of it, I know there's quite a lot of work in Spanish out there, and we
Mm.
need to encourage more of it. Um, but ultimately, I mean, because then you can run into the other problem. In Southern Asia, there's a lot of military history being written, but it's almost entirely consumed internally. So nobody knows that the books exist. I mean,
Mm.
I'm just giving you this example here. There are a series of books which look at Indian Air Force campaigns since 1948. And there's an author called Air Marshal Bharat Kumar. He's an Indian writer. His work is beyond exceptional. It is truly amazing what he has done. His analysis, his look at records, his look at everything is beyond amazing. All of that stuff's published in India. It's not available in the West. Nobody knows about it. Nobody reads it. Everybody gets everything wrong because of it. So what we need to do is to strike that mix of access out there and access here.
Right, right.
So we need that dual approach, and I think that really needs to be encouraged more. I mean, the what you're seeing to some extent is online publication taking the place of it to some extent. I think that needs to be encouraged more. I mean, the Dominican Republic, some authors in the Dominican Republic have made a really good start in that regard, in documenting, military and aviation history in the Dominican Republic. Santiago Flores from Mexico has done a really good job in respect of that, bringing it online. But I think there's a lot more we can do. And I think also what we also need to look at is to look at conflict and look at military history, not purely from the operational angle or the technological angle, but from that societal and political angle. Because once we understand this, all of those things are interlinked in some way.
Hmm.
And once we appreciate it, and this is particularly so for our neck of the woods, and I would say once if the African continent starts looking at it as well, there that be worthwhile there, because our our conflicts and our militaries are very much part of our society. It's not a professional military like in India and Pakistan. The military is a professional military. It's not a conscript military. It's cut off from society. It's conflicts between armies are conflicts between armies. Our conflicts have very much been societal conflicts, whether it's internal or external. You know, you look at mobilization during the Chaco War or the War of the Triple Alliance or even the War of the Pacific, how that impacted society generally, or the Mexican Revolution, how that impacted Mexican society, how it, so all these things, more for our conflicts than for many other places, um, need to be looked at in that regard. And I think it has to be encouraged. It has to be facilitated, especially with the wealth of scholarship that's now available to us.
It's great that some of the authors that you are mentioning have publications with Hillian and Company as part of the Latin
Yeah,
America Award series. And talking about that, I would like to let the public know about your works because I did have a good time reading your book,
yeah, thank
Trinidad
you.
1990. Uh, Let me see. The Caribbean's Islamist Insurrection. Other books published by you, which are available through Hillian and Company's Terror and Response, the India and Pakistan Proxy War, Urgent Fury, Grenada. I would love to talk to you about that because I've been trying to find someone to talk about Grenada forever, and I
I think that
haven't been.
that's a conflict, and it's especially important because last year was the 40th anniversary of Urgent Fury,
Right.
and I don't think anybody spoke very much about it, especially since a lot of key players in 1990 are no more with us,
Mm.
from the Grenadian side, and that when I spoke of conflicts in society, that's a small conflict, but had a huge impact on Grenadian society. And Grenada is a very tiny country,
No,
and
I've been trying to find someone to talk about that
it is
conflict
quite an
forever.
amazing. It's an amazing little conflict,
Hmm.
and it's an amazing story.
Yeah.
It's an amazing story. I mean, to this day, Maurice Bishop is viewed as a hero for whatever reason. I can't figure it out myself, but there's no doubt that he's still regarded as a hero.
So my first karate teacher, I practiced Goju Ryu. He's a veteran, and he participated in
Yeah,
Grenada, and he was shot on the leg. So and I found out about this because he told me that he participated there, but it is an otherwise on very unknown event that is very important in our region, the
yeah. I
Caribbean.
was 10 years old when it happened, and I remember. I mean, you had in Trinidad and Tobago, we had one television station at the time.
Hmm.
When Maurice Bishop was murdered, the shock that went through the Caribbean was the English speaking Caribbean. Remember, we're small countries, all linked by a British colonial past. The
Right.
murder of Maurice Bishop hit almost everybody very hard. Because what you may not know is a lot of people from Grenada came to Trinidad and
Hmm.
settled there
I
over
mean,
many
it's north
decades.
of you.
Yeah, but for work purposes, many of them came,
Mm.
and they became an integral part of Trinidadian society. Um, but they're very much from Grenada.
Well, hopefully we can.
Anytime you want, man. Anytime.
I appreciate that a lot because it's been very hard to find, and I've been trying to find even
Uh, It's
veterans, and it's very.
it's an amazing story. It's a very great shame
Hmm.
that some of the Grenadian participants, including the head of the military junta at the time, General Hudson Austin, he has passed on now. But I mean, some of his interviews survive after
Hmm.
his imprisonment, and you listen to it and very you feel very moved, even though he was on the wrong side, and he was on the wrong side. You dealt with someone who seemed to be genuinely remorseful for what happened.
Hmm.
And we need to appreciate our conflicts,
Oh yeah, no,
and we need
we.
to encourage our researchers. I mean, I would say this. I'll be very honest with you. I was encouraged in a lot of my research by Indians in India to tell me
Hmm.
to go on because they were curious. First of all, they were curious how any Indians survived in the Caribbean in the first place. How we ended up there in the first place. But they encouraged me to research. They opened their hearts out to me when I did some work on India and Pakistan. They talked to me. They encouraged me. They encouraged me to write about our conflicts in the Caribbean. And honestly, we need to encourage our people to do more
Oh yeah,
because
no,
we've got so much to tell the world.
100%. So let's go through because I do want to mention all of them for people who might be
Sure.
interested. There is 90 years of the Indian Air Force, present capabilities and future prospects. Armed Forces of the English speaking Caribbean, that's very interesting. The Bahamas, Barbados, Guyana, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago. Nuclear India, developing India's nuclear arms for reluctance to try it. And then Operation Cactus, India military intervention in the I never knew how
Maldives.
to Maldives,
Maldives. Yeah.
Las Maldivas.
Yeah.
Okay. Operation Mekhdud, Indians war in Siachen,
Yeah.
right? Or
That's
Siachen.
on the Siachen. It's on the border with China and Pakistan. It's the highest battlefield on planet Earth.
Okay, and that is still roaring.
That's
They
still going
still
on.
have.
Still going
Hmm.
on. And with India and China now facing off in that area, it becomes incredibly important because let me put it this way: between India and China, they've massed hundreds of thousands of troops on those borders, backed up by you name it, it's there. That if anything should really go wrong now, it will be a major confrontation there.
Hmm. Yeah, so we need to pay attention to that because it may be, but I'm seeing some diplomacy going on.
Well, the diplomacy is going on to prevent a war. Nobody's really thinking it's going to work. What they're just saying is keep talking, and prevent any shooting from happening for now.
Hmm.
Um, you know, India's position is status quo ante before 2020. China's view is no,
Hmm.
right? So, I mean, where you meet in that mess,
Yeah,
right?
that's a
Yeah, and then so that's a major conflict that's there.
well. If you someone in the audience who would like to understand this present day conflict, well, this is a book that might interest you. Operation Magdud, India's war in Siachen, 1984 to 2020, and then the one we are talking about right now, which is Trinidad, 1990, the Caribbean's Islamist insurrection, and then Cargill, 1999, South Asia's first post-nuclear conflict.
Yeah, this was the 25th anniversary of the end of the Kargil War,
Hmm.
July 26th, in fact. So it was, at the time I'd written it, it was I was very privileged to have been able to interview many of, not leaders, but we're talking about guys who were actually holding a rifle and bayonet
Hmm.
during Kargil, climbing those mountains and facing off against a very determined adversary. So I was very privileged. Again, that's where I tell you, we need to encourage our people within our region, because I would say that I got so much encouragement from Indians in India. Even though I'm not an Indian from India, I have very little link to other than ancestrally.
Hmm.
But they encourage, we need to encourage our scholars, our researchers, our amateur historians. Let us not leave this to academia alone. This has to be something where we can get popular history out there. We can get people with anecdotes. All that is part of our history.
No, yeah, no, 100%. It is, and hopefully we're doing something with this platform.
Yeah, very much so. Very
Bye.
much
Yeah.
so. And I mean, I'm really hoping you do tackle Grenada, because Grenada is one conflict that the Americans have done a very good job at their operational history. But the sociological history of the Grenada Revolution, the impact, the challenges it faced, the why the Grenada Revolution is still seen in very equivocal terms. It's not seen as this Marxist entity that just came there, even though it very much was. Um, it's romanticized. I mean, there are actually poems about it
Hmm.
doing Iran still.
That is something I try to go against here in this podcast a lot. I try to tell people all the time, listen, history is something that is actively used as a weapon for ideological purposes. I do not want to be
Yeah,
propagandist. I care about the objective matters, the
yeah,
objective history,
but
what the evidence tells
but
me. If that
it's
goes against certain narratives that are
yeah.
popular,
This
so
is
be it.
That's actually not quite what I'm getting at here. It's like this in Grenada. You had
Right.
one dictatorship essentially replaced by another for a long time. That's a basic thing. Gary replaced by Bishop. Excuse me. When Bishop came to power, the way that Grenadians viewed that was as a new dawn, a liberation. Bishop had so much goodwill going for him that they were prepared to overlook these Marxist Leninist leanings of it. They were poets. There was a very popular poet called Paul Keens Douglas, a brilliant storyteller. He's Grenadian. He wrote a poem about it called Fedon's Flute, going right back into the history of so. But the fact that Bishop's government turned out to be venal, incompetent, cruel, and everything has largely been forgotten because of the way Bishop met his end at the hands of people who are much worse than he was. You know, and
Mm.
it's an interesting historiography that Bishop to this day is still viewed as a Caribbean hero rather than someone that none of us would have wanted to live under.
We are going to set that up. We are going to
Sure,
coordinate
anytime
to
you want,
make
man.
that happen.
Anytime you want.
All right.
Anytime you
So
want.
yeah, as soon as we finish this episode,
Yeah,
we're
no
gonna
problem.
make that happen. Oh, okay. So yeah, I think we have learned a lot about this 1990 conflict that took place in Trinidad. In of course, 1990. We're gonna talk again for the audience. Please consider procuring Dr. Sanjay Badri-Maharaj's books. Um, they're incredible works, and also available in not only physical but only digital.
Yeah.
So that's a
They
great
are available
option.
digitally, so you save on shipping.
Great. Yeah. No, you do. Yeah. 100%. Well, thank you very much,
It's
Dr.
my great
Sanjay
pleasure.
Badri
My
Maharaj.
pleasure. Anytime you want. Anytime.
Okay, we'll talk soon again. Thank you
Anytime.
very much again,
Take care.
and this has been a new episode of Archipiélago Histórico. Until next time.